The United States ambassador to Canada just made a statement that essentially set fire to the diplomatic playbook. Pete Hoekstra went on record to express complete confusion over why Canadians are boycotting American alcohol and pushing back against incoming tariffs. He claimed he does not understand the frustration, but I am here to tell you this is not about a misunderstanding. This is about a calculated fracture in the North American alliance. What we are witnessing right now in May of 2026 is the active dismantling of the legal roadmap established by the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, a trade deal that Donald Trump himself negotiated, signed, and celebrated as a historic victory. Now, that same administration is hitting Canada with new economic tariffs that directly violate the spirit of that exact agreement. Ottawa is not just reacting with anger. They are executing a deliberate retaliatory freeze on American imports. There is no ambiguity here. There is no room for concession, only cold, hard economic leverage. You need to look past the political theater and pay attention to what the data is actually saying, because the foundation of cross-border trade is cracking in real time. Let us strip away the political noise and look at the exact mechanics of what is happening on the ground right now. On May 27th, 2026, the United States government has officially implemented a new wave of economic tariffs against Canadian imports. This is not a proposal. This is not a draft. This is active enforced policy. On the other side of the border, Canada has responded with equal and immediate precision. Multiple Canadian provinces have instituted targeted, coordinated bans on American alcohol imports, effectively choking off a highly lucrative revenue stream for United States distributors. To the casual observer, this might look like a standard temporary trade disagreement, but geopolitical analysts see a much colder, calculated reality unfolding. This is a fundamental stress test of the North American supply chain, a deliberate high-stakes economic collision designed to measure exactly where the breaking points lie. You have to understand the foundational paradox sitting at the absolute center of this diplomatic firestorm. The United States and Canada do not just trade with each other on a whim, they operate under the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. This is a binding, comprehensive international treaty explicitly designed to prevent exactly this kind of chaotic, unilateral tariff warfare. Donald Trump negotiated this exact treaty. He signed this exact treaty. He paraded it in front of the American public as a monumental, historic victory for domestic workers and manufacturers. And yet, the very same administration is now bypassing its own established legal framework. They are demanding compliance. They are applying heavy economic pressure. They are expecting rapid capitulation. But that expected capitulation never arrived. Instead, Ottawa executed a hard, unyielding block. When Ambassador Pete Hoekstra goes on national television and claims he simply does not understand why Canadians are suddenly so frustrated, we must translate that diplomatic rhetoric into actual strategic reality. Economic observers note that Washington likely anticipated a very different reaction. The traditional playbook suggested a short period of vocal complaints from Ottawa, followed inevitably by quiet, behind-the-scenes concessions. The White House expected the Canadian government to absorb the political damage, pacify their citizens, and quietly adjust their supply chains to accommodate American demands. That is exactly how the old geopolitical model worked for decades, but the paradigm has entirely shifted. Canada is now utilizing direct economic retaliation as a primary diplomatic weapon. A strategic read of this situation shows that the provincial alcohol bans are not a spontaneous emotional reaction from angry citizens. They are a calculated surgical countermeasure. By explicitly cutting off American consumer goods, Canada is sending a very specific mathematical message directly to Washington. They are proving that economic pain can and will flow in both directions across the 49th parallel. Market data from multiple northern border states already indicates a noticeable, undeniable drop in cross-border commerce, regional tourism, and bilateral procurement contracts. Businesses in the United States are feeling the immediate tangible sting of this coordinated Canadian resistance. This is the stark reality of modern trade confrontation. It is not fought with loud theatrical declarations. It is fought with supply chain disruptions. It is fought with consumer boycotts. It is fought with targeted legislative strikes. The administration in Washington is finding out in real time that their closest economic ally is no longer willing to play the role of a passive, compliant partner. Let us pivot and look precisely at what happens when you introduce this level of volatility into a deeply integrated economic zone. The immediate surface-level reaction is the trade confrontation we just discussed, but the profound unintended consequence is the absolute destruction of systemic predictability. You have to understand that international trade is not built purely on the exchange of goods. It is built entirely on the concept of legal certainty. When multinational corporations decide where to build a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing facility, they do not base their calculations on political speeches or friendly handshakes. They base them on the binding, written guarantees embedded within documents like the Canada-U.S.-Mexico Agreement. That specific agreement was supposed to be the ultimate shield against arbitrary economic conflict. It was explicitly marketed to the citizens and investors of both nations as a modernized, bulletproof framework that would guarantee smooth, uninterrupted commerce across the North American continent. When the administration in Washington suddenly decides to ignore that framework and levy new tariffs, they are not merely placing a tax on specific goods. They are actively destroying the very concept of trust that keeps the border functioning. Think about the massive, deeply integrated industries like the automotive sector. Individual parts routinely cross the international border half a dozen times before a single vehicle is fully assembled. That level of extreme, hyper-efficient integration requires absolute legal stability. By deploying surprise tariffs, the United States has injected poison into that exact stability. This is the critical variable that Ambassador Pete Hoekstra seems to completely miss when he expresses his bewilderment on television. He treats the Canadian response as an isolated tantrum over a specific product. I need you to see the larger geopolitical board. The Canadian government is not simply defending its domestic industries, they are defending the fundamental validity of the treaty itself. If Ottawa were to simply accept these incoming tariffs without mounting a severe proportional counterattack, they would essentially be admitting that the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement is completely worthless. They would be accepting a brand new paradigm where the United States can alter the terms of continental trade at any given moment, for any political reason, without facing any tangible consequences. No sovereign nation can ever accept those terms. Therefore, the unintended consequence of Washington attempting a quick, aggressive economic squeeze is that they have accidentally triggered an existential defense mechanism within the Canadian government. Ottawa is restricting American alcohol not because they harbor any desire to harm American distillers, but because they must prove to Washington that violating the foundational treaty carries a heavy, unavoidable, and immediate financial cost. Now, we must look at the secondary shockwave of this massive strategic miscalculation. By choosing to entirely bypass the established dispute resolution mechanisms built directly into the trade agreement, the United States has broadcast a chilling message to global financial markets. International investors are watching this firestorm unfold right now in May of 2026, and they are rapidly recalculating their risk assessments. If the United States is perfectly willing to abandon the core principles of a major trade deal with its closest geographic and cultural ally, what does that mean for every other bilateral agreement Washington holds around the entire world? The consequence here bleeds far beyond the borders of North America. The administration intended to project undeniable economic dominance and force a rapid capitulation on their own terms. Instead, they have severely damaged the architectural integrity of their own global trade policies. They have forced Canada into an aggressive defensive posture that will inevitably damage local economies on both sides of the border. And most critically, they have replaced a system of managed, predictable economic growth with a chaotic environment of continuous retaliation. When the rules of the game are discarded by the very people who wrote them, the only remaining currency is leverage. And as Washington is rapidly discovering, leverage is no longer a monopoly held exclusively by the United States. Canada has found its leverage, and they are demonstrating a sudden, absolute willingness to use it until the legal equilibrium is fully restored. I am here to act as your translator. When you watch high-level diplomatic briefings, you are listening to a carefully constructed, highly sanitized version of reality. My job is to take those sanitized statements, strip away the political armor, and show you the raw machinery operating underneath. I want you to focus directly on Ambassador Pete Hoekstra and his specific, highly televised claim that he simply does not understand the Canadian frustration over the current trade dispute. Let me be absolutely clear with you. The United States ambassador is not confused. He is not out of the loop. He is not missing the point. He is executing a highly specific, aggressively tested communication strategy. When a seasoned political operative goes on international television and feigns absolute bewilderment at a perfectly rational economic response, they are doing it for one reason only. They are attempting to control the narrative framing. By acting confused, Washington is subtly shifting the burden of justification onto Ottawa. They are attempting to paint Canada not as a sovereign nation defending a legal treaty, but as an irrational, emotional, and unpredictable actor throwing a localized tantrum over imported alcohol. This is a classic negotiation tactic. You invalidate the response of your opponent by pretending their reaction is completely disproportionate to reality. But I have spent the last 72 hours tearing through the internal trade data, cross-referencing the public statements, and honestly, I have lost sleep watching how rapidly this structural foundation is deteriorating. The numbers do not lie, and the numbers reveal exactly what Washington is actually doing behind closed doors. We have to look at the domestic calendar. We are sitting in May of 2026. The United States is accelerating directly into a highly contentious midterm election cycle. The administration requires immediate, visible, and aggressive protectionist victories to secure their domestic voting base. They need to show their manufacturing sector that they are fighting for them, even if that fight requires burning down an established international treaty. The tariffs on Canada are not an accident. They are a domestic campaign strategy disguised as foreign policy. The administration needs a villain, and for the purposes of this specific election cycle, Canadian imports fit the profile perfectly. But here is where the strategy encountered a massive, unpredicted variable. The strategic translators in Washington completely misread the political climate in Ottawa. They assumed they were dealing with the historic, highly compliant version of the Canadian government. They assumed they could launch a targeted economic strike, endure a week of polite diplomatic protests, and then quietly extract major concessions. That was the established playbook for 40 years. However, they are now dealing with Prime Minister Mark Carney. Under this specific administration, Canada has fundamentally rewritten its own response protocols. Washington launched a probe to test the perimeter of Canadian resolve, expecting the fence to collapse. Instead, they hit a reinforced concrete wall. The coordinated bans on American alcohol are not just a random selection of consumer goods. They are a highly calibrated, mathematically precise counterstrike designed to inflict maximum political pain on specific American states that rely heavily on cross-border exports. Canada is not just defending itself, Canada is counterattacking. This brings us to the core realization of this deep dive. The confusion you see from the United States ambassador is not entirely faked. Part of it is a genuine systemic shock that the old rules of engagement no longer apply. Washington is genuinely struggling to process a reality where Canada does not automatically fold under extreme pressure. They are witnessing a paradigm shift where their northern neighbor is perfectly willing to endure immediate economic pain in order to secure long-term geopolitical respect. When Hoekstra points the finger at Canadian politicians and accuses them of artificially manufacturing anti-American sentiment, he is trying to delegitimize a profoundly organic movement. Political analysts and economic observers across the spectrum agree that the Canadian public is not being manipulated into this boycott. The public feels a genuine, deep-seated betrayal regarding the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement. They watched Donald Trump sign the deal. They watched him celebrate the deal, and now they are watching his administration violate the deal. No politician had to manufacture that anger. The anger is the natural, inevitable byproduct of a broken promise. You must understand that diplomacy is not about friendship. Diplomacy is about leverage. Diplomacy is about consequence. Diplomacy is about predictability. The United States removed the predictability. Canada responded by applying the consequence. And now both sides are locked in a desperate battle for leverage. The diplomatic language will remain polite. The press conferences will remain orderly. But underneath that calm surface, we are watching a brutal, uncompromising economic war of attrition. Washington demanded a surrender. Ottawa delivered a blockade. And now the entire North American continent is waiting to see who blinks first. We have spent the last 15 minutes dissecting the geopolitical chessboard. Now I want to pull the camera all the way down to the ground. When politicians in Washington and Ottawa talk about trade disputes, they intentionally use abstract macroeconomic terms. They talk about trade deficits. They talk about strategic leverage. They talk about continental supply chains. But tariffs do not exist in the abstract. Tariffs are taxes, and governments do not pay taxes. You pay them. Look at the institutional investment data from this morning, May 27th, 2026. Capital expenditure along the northern border is freezing in real time. Cross-border logistics companies are parking their fleets. Multinational manufacturers are pausing their expansion plans. Why? Because businesses can price in regulations, they can price in taxes, but they cannot price in sudden irrational unpredictability. When the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement is treated like a mere suggestion rather than binding international law, the risk premium on every single cross-border transaction skyrockets. The immediate macroeconomic impact is a massive structural deceleration of continental commerce. Consider the modern logistics network. The North American economy operates on a system called just-in-time manufacturing. Parts are not stored in massive warehouses. They are kept in constant motion, crossing the border exactly when they are needed on the assembly line. It is a masterpiece of efficiency. It is a marvel of engineering. It is entirely dependent on absolute legal frictionlessness at the border checkpoints. The second you introduce retaliatory tariffs, you introduce customs disputes, legal gridlock, and administrative friction. The entire just-in-time machine grinds to a devastating halt. Warehouses sit empty. Assembly lines shut down. Workers are sent home. But I do not want to talk about multinational corporations anymore. I want to talk about you. I want to take this massive multi-billion-dollar diplomatic failure and place it directly on your kitchen table, because the reality of this trade war is not going to be felt in the halls of Parliament. It is going to be felt at the grocery checkout. It is going to be felt at the hardware store. It is going to be felt deep inside your monthly budget. Let us look at the mechanics of consumer pricing. The United States placed tariffs on Canadian goods. Canada retaliated by banning American alcohol. But the chain reaction absolutely does not stop there. Let us break down a very specific everyday scenario. You walk into a local supermarket in Toronto or Vancouver. You are buying imported agricultural goods. Because of the escalating diplomatic standoff, the freight companies hauling that produce are now facing increased border scrutiny and reciprocal surcharges. It takes them an extra 12 hours to clear customs. That delay increases their fuel burn. It increases their labor costs. It degrades the shelf life of the product. By the time that item reaches the display rack, its retail price has been artificially inflated. You are not paying for better quality. You are paying a geopolitical inefficiency tax. I spent the weekend looking at the projected price index for basic consumer staples over the next financial quarter. I have to be completely honest with you. The projections are deeply unsettling. We are already operating in a highly sensitive inflation environment in 2026. Now add a completely unnecessary layer of artificial friction to the cost of everyday goods. We are talking about the cascading effect on agricultural imports. We are talking about the disruption to regional energy markets. We are talking about the surging cost of building materials for residential housing. Washington claims they are protecting American workers. Ottawa claims they are defending Canadian sovereignty. But the actual mathematical reality is that they are both engineering a synchronized reduction in your purchasing power. The politicians get the headlines, the diplomats get the leverage, the citizens get the bill. This is the absolute tragedy of using economic tariffs as a blunt force political weapon. The collateral damage is highly predictable and it is entirely domestic. A Canadian family living in Ontario is now going to pay a premium to subsidize a political dispute they never asked for. An American business owner in Michigan is losing their most reliable client base because their government decided to bypass a signed treaty. This is not abstract diplomacy anymore. This is direct financial extraction. We are currently sitting at a critical intersection. It is exactly 2:33 in the afternoon on May 27th, 2026. The political theater has peaked. The economic damage is actively compounding. Where does this diplomatic firestorm go from here? As a geopolitical analyst, I do not deal in speculation. I deal in probabilities. Looking at the structural reality of the North American supply chain, there are two highly probable scenarios unfolding over the next 90 days. The first scenario is a forced de-escalation through institutional channels. The economic pain in crucial border states becomes politically intolerable for Washington. The public rhetoric quietly cools down. Both administrations step back from the cameras and finally engage the formal dispute resolution mechanisms embedded directly within the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement. The tariffs are quietly walked back in exchange for minor, highly publicized regulatory adjustments. The treaty survives, but the trust remains permanently scarred. The second scenario is much more profound. We witness a permanent structural realignment. Washington refuses to back down, viewing capitulation as political suicide ahead of their domestic elections. In response, Ottawa stops viewing the United States as its primary, indispensable economic anchor. Canada accelerates a massive historic pivot toward the European Union and the Indo-Pacific markets. They utilize the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership to bypass American trade infrastructure entirely. North America ceases to be an integrated economic fortress and simply becomes two neighboring countries trading strictly out of geographical convenience. This is the absolute reality of the geopolitical board in 2026. The decisions made in the next 72 hours will dictate the economic trajectory of the entire continent for the next decade. So I turn the question directly to you. Look at the economic data. Look at the political leverage. Do you believe the Canadian government has the domestic stamina to maintain this hardline economic resistance? Or will the sheer financial gravity of the United States eventually force Ottawa to compromise? Go down into the comments right now and give me your exact strategic read on this situation. If you want to stay ahead of the political curve and understand the real mechanisms driving international policy, you need to subscribe to this channel. I will continue to break down the diplomatic noise and give you the unfiltered economic reality.